Thing number two, we're moving to Lyn Alden. Lyn Alden summarizes an entire ebook in one post. Is she gonna put you out of business, Jerry? Gary?
I wouldn't put it past her. She's fantastic. Lynn is a super smart person. She's also a really good writer and communicator. Last year in the fourth quarter, DKI wrote an ebook called Counterintuitive Inflation. And in that ebook, we explained how Federal Reserve rate hikes can lead to more inflation. And basically, the short version of that is, the US is borrowing right now about $35 trillion. So if you increase the interest rate, if the Fed hikes to try to control inflation, what that's going to do is it's going to increase the interest expense that our government's going to have to pay. And because we're way, way, way over budget, what will have to happen is we're going to have to print more dollars to pay for it. Well, guess what you get with more dollar printing? You end up with more inflation. And so, we put out this 20-page ebook, Counterintuitive Inflation, with 17 charts and graphs in it to explain all of that. We've also written extensively on the quiet war between the Fed on one hand, who's raising rates to try to control inflation, and Congress and Treasury, on the other hand, who's been overspending and monetizing that overspending at a level that's creating more inflation. So these two parts of the government, and yeah, technically the Fed isn't part of the government, but it really is. They're at odds with each other. And so, Lynn summarized it all. I'm going to read her tweet or post on X. Some analysts say that monetary policy is not tight enough to curtail inflation. The real issue is that fiscal policy is too loose to curtail inflation. And at 120% public debt to GDP ratio with ballooning interest expense, tighter monetary policy loosens fiscal policy further. So there it is. She basically summed up a 20-page ebook in, one tweet. So her work is phenomenal.
Gary, we know we've talked about government reducing spending and the likelihood of that happening essentially being close to or if not near zero. What does the world look like for the average American if rate hikes like what we had in the 70s don't work? And in fact, we think that they probably will not work the way they should to curtail inflation.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. So, back in the 1970s, when the US had this huge bout of inflation, debt to GDP was around 30%. And what that meant was that Paul Volcker, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, raised interest rates to right around 20%. Okay, so for people who, you don't like your mortgage payments now, or, you don't like your credit card bills now, try to imagine what it would look like with interest rates at around 4 times the current level. And the issue is we can't do that now. Powell can't raise rates that way because he'll just end up creating more of the same problem. And that's Lynn's point. And the term she's used to describe it is fiscal dominance, which simply means that we owe so much money and we've spent so much money that what the Fed does with monetary policy is just, it's not that effective. And, realize it was just 2.5 years ago that Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, secretary of the Treasury, were saying inflation's transitory. They thought they'd have this knocked out in about 12 months. And 2.5 years later, they're realizing that they may not be able to lower rates at all this year. So this is turned into a multi-year non-transitory problem. Your question is, what does this mean for people? And the answer is inflation works for wealthy people who can use debt to buy hard assets. It's great for property owners. It blows up bubbles. So you end up with higher stock market prices. And that's great for wealthy people who own a lot of stocks and who own property and have access to debt that will be devalued over time. It's horrible for most of the country because if you're spending the vast majority of your paycheck to ensure that you have health insurance and, your rent or your mortgage, maybe childcare, car payments, food, putting gas in the car. I mean, I've just in a few words there summarized most families' expenses.
Mm-hmm.
Those things are all going to be much more expensive. Um, the best way to protect yourself if you're an investor is to look at dollar alternatives, things like gold, Bitcoin. Silver it just crossed 30 for the first time in years. We had Ryan Sullivan on last week talking about agricultural prices. Basically, commodities are hard assets, and these are things that are easy to buy using ETFs if you're not in a position to hold the physical, and most people are not, right? Most people are not in a position to hold a lot of physical commodities, certainly not oil or uranium. But those are the best ways to deal with it for the part of the country that's living paycheck to paycheck. It's going to be very, very rough. I wish I had better advice, but the only thing you can do in that situation is, do your best to cut expenses, to save, to buy things like, large stocks of food when they go on sale. And I realize for a lot of people, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, a lot of what I'm saying is not going to be possible. I wish there were more I could do about it. I'd love to tell you, just vote for more fiscal sanity. But, we had that great point from Mike Shedlock, Mish, who's on the DKI Board of Advisors from, I think it was 2, 3 weeks ago, when Mish was saying, hey, you can't vote your way out of this. Neither party is going to cut spending. Unfortunately, I agree with him. So I think, the policies that Congress is enacting in the name of trying to help people are going to make life very hard for a lot of people. I have sympathy for it. I don't have the power to stop it. And, I'd also point out that, when Lyn is talking about fiscal dominance and the problems with that, that doesn't mean she is rooting for a particular policy. It doesn't mean she wants that to happen. She's saying this is the result of what is happening.